So this course is all about using ChatGPT and Midjourney in your day-to-day life. And we're starting with ChatGPT for the first portion of the course. I think it's pretty safe to assume that most of you are familiar with ChatGPT, you know what it is. But in this video, if you don't know what it is, I'll explain, but I'll also talk about some important terms that may come up or will come up throughout the course. By the way, all the imagery you see here is generated by Midjourney. So just a little shout out to Midjourney and everything you see on the slides here. So what exactly is ChatGPT? ChatGPT is a web-based interface to a large language model, and there's a couple of choices for which model that is. Basically, it's a web client that allows us to communicate and have a conversation with an AI model behind the scenes. Typically, we provide text as input, and we'll get human-like text in response, although sometimes, with GPT-4, we'll actually get images in response, diagrams in response, downloadable files in response. It's not only text to text, but that's how it started. And as we've already seen in the previous video, we can use ChatGPT to generate text, code, analysis, visualizations, a whole bunch of other things. So this is just some of my chat history. I used ChatGPT in a very simple way to get it to write me some tweets. I hate Twitter. I'm very bad at Twitter. I had it write me some tweets. But here's something completely different. I gave it a link to a video, a long video that was reviewing Apple's Vision Pro mixed reality AR headset. Too long for me to watch, but I wanted to know what the reviewer thought. And I used a plugin to help me do this. We'll cover plugins in the course. It summarized a whole YouTube video and gave me a nice, quick summary that was very easy to read. Here, I gave it some code, a data set, and it generated me diagrams. Here, I had it generate me a full web application. So there's a lot of things that we can do with it, but at the end of the day, the core mechanism is that there's a text box down here where I can type messages and get some sort of message back. It's important to note the distinction here between ChatGPT and then the underlying models, GPT 3.5, GPT 4, and then presumably eventually GPT 4 point something or GPT 5. The models are what does all of the hard work. The models are trained over months and months, or in some cases years, trained on all sorts of data. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And one way of communicating with these models is via ChatGPT. We type something into the text box on the website. Do I need to put fresh eggs in the fridge? That is then sent off to a model, and then the model responds back with some sort of text, and we see it rendered in the browser. That's the ChatGPT workflow, which, by the way, you don't have to refrigerate fresh eggs if you haven't washed them. But we also could communicate with the very same models using their APIs, which is not what this course covers. I have a whole separate course on using the GPT family of APIs. But basically, you can integrate the functionality of these models within your own applications. So you can ask it a question through code, it's sent off to the model, and you get a response back through code. But in this course, we're talking about ChatGPT, which is a way to communicate with those very same models using a web-based interface where I don't have to write code, right? I just type text into a box and hit enter. A little more terminology. LLM is something you may see throughout the course or just reading documentation. It stands for large language models. These are a family of AI models that work with text. They understand and generate human-like text. And the way that they work is that they're initially trained on a huge amount of text data, and they learn to predict the next word, or technically what we call the next token, in a sentence or in a piece of output. What is slightly controversial is what the models are trained on. There's all sorts of ongoing lawsuits and criticism over not just OpenAI, which is the parent company that created ChatGPT and the GPT models, but all sorts of different AI model companies, because what they basically did was take the entirety of the internet, or at least a very large subset of the internet, of Wikipedia, of databases of online books that are obviously written and created and have license owned by other people, the authors usually. So they take all this information, huge data sets of what is essentially most of the web, and they train models on it. And like I said, it's kind of controversial because there's all sorts of weird, tricky licensing issues there. I mean, some of my own content, my own videos, YouTube descriptions, my own course content shows up in the model. I can only presume that it was trained on my content and many other Udemy courses because I can ask it very specific questions about myself, but also stuff straight from my courses, and it uses the same language that I use in my courses. So these models take tons and tons of time, tons of data to train, but then once they're trained, they are trained. And then from that point onwards, we can basically converse or provide input text and get output text. Also, the information you see here is all about GPT-3. OpenAI has not released any information on the training of GPT-4. We'll talk about the distinction between the two shortly as well, but I think that they want to avoid any controversy, so they have not revealed what parts of the internet, what new data sets. There's lots of images that it was trained on, lots of code that was trained on. There's speculation that it was trained on the entirety of GitHub, but none of it has been officially confirmed by OpenAI. Now, while we're talking about terminology, the GPT portion of ChatGPT, or the model names GPT-3, GPT-4, and so on, stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. That's really all you need to know. I don't even know if you truly need to know that. That's where the T comes from in GPT. Generative, I think that part's self-explanatory. Pre-trained, we already discussed. The models are pre-trained. It's basically a one-time thing. They're trained, and then they're usable. Okay, so that's our quick intro to the concept of ChatGPT. It's this web-based interface where we can type text, hit enter, and that text is sent off to a model behind the scenes. Which model it's sent to is something that we can control, and that's what we're going to talk about very shortly. The next thing we need to talk about is a little bit about how ChatGPT works at a very high level. Here's a conversation that I had with ChatGPT. It's a very real one and also very trivial and stupid. My name is Colt. And then it responds, "Nice to meet you, Colt. How can I assist you?" And then I asked, "How many chickens do I need to get a dozen eggs a day?" And then it says, "On average, a hen lays 5 to 7 eggs per week, so you need 12 to 14 hens." And then I asked it, "What is my name?" "Your name is Colt." So clearly, it seems like it remembers stuff from earlier in the conversation. And if it didn't, it would be very hard to use. But behind the scenes, what's actually happening and what's important to understand is that every single time I talk within a single conversation with ChatGPT, every message I send, my entire message history is sent along with it. So my first message is, "My name is Colt." It takes that and it generates a response. "Nice to meet you, Colt. How can I assist you today?" Then, when I send my next message, "How many chickens do I need to get a dozen eggs a day?" this whole transcript is fed through to the model. All three messages. My first message, ChatGPT's response, and my second message. This is now the full context it gets. So it's not just getting this new message, it gets my full transcript. And then it responds, "On average, a hen will lay about 5 to 7, blah, blah, blah." And then for my final message here, where I asked, "What is my name?" it doesn't just magically remember that my first message said, "My name is Colt." It doesn't keep that in its memory anywhere. Instead, this full chat transcript is sent. And the very first thing I said is, "My name is Colt." The last thing I said is, "What is my name?" It has the information needed contained within this transcript to respond back with, "Your name is Colt." So whenever I have a conversation, even a long conversation like this one here, I'm kind of zoomed in way far, but this is a conversation I had about building a web application. Every message, if I send a new message in here, down at the very bottom, whatever I type here will be sent along with the full conversation history off to ChatGPT or off to one of the GPT models, and then it will generate a response because it has all of this context. It's not working with one message at a time, it's working with the full conversation each time, including ChatGPT's own responses. So I just want to explain that up front because I think a lot of people assume that the logical way it works is that it has a memory. It remembers every word or every message that you send it and every message it sends back. It's kind of true, but the only way it works is that the full transcript is sent to the model every time we talk to it. Next, let's briefly talk about the difference between GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4. These are the two choices that we currently are presented with when we open up ChatGPT. And if you don't have an account, you haven't signed up, don't worry, that's all coming up next. But as you can see here, I have GPT 3.5, technically it's called 3.5 Turbo, and GPT-4 as my options. One thing I have to start by saying is that GPT-4 is currently only available to Plus users. So we'll talk about at the end of this video whether it's worth it or not, or if you need to be a Plus user. The spoiler answer is not really, you don't need it, but if you want access to some of the best, coolest features, then you do have to pay for it. So what's the distinction here? According to just a little pop-up here, GPT 3.5 Turbo is the fastest model and is great for most everyday tasks. GPT-4 is more capable and more creative and better at advanced reasoning. Plus, it has some of these extra features down here that aren't available to GPT 3.5 users. So again, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. GPT 3.5 Turbo is a finely tuned version of the older model, GPT-3. And there are earlier versions of GPT, by the way. We don't have access to them using ChatGPT, but using the APIs, you can communicate with GPT-3 if you wanted to. But with ChatGPT, we have two choices, 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4. GPT-4 is an entirely new model. A lot of the details around it are not public as far as how it was trained, the size of the model, the number of parameters. There's a lot of stuff that has just not been talked about. But the short story is that it's better. It's a much larger model, trained on more information, and tends to give better results in certain areas. According to OpenAI's marketing page for GPT-4, they call it their most advanced system that makes safer and more useful responses. So some of the things that GPT-4 is better at include writing really finely tuned language, more human language that doesn't feel always like it's coming out of ChatGPT. It still is sometimes easy to identify any text generated by ChatGPT, but it's harder to do so with GPT-4. It's better at complex problem solving. I'll show some examples of that. It's better at generating code because it's not publicly shared, but it's likely that it was trained on a heck of a lot more code than GPT 3.5. And probably most importantly, it's better at being factual, not making things up when it doesn't know. It's a topic called hallucination that we'll talk about soon. One downside, by the way, is that GPT-4 tends to be slower. And GPT 3.5, as they say on the marketing page or on the ChatGPT page, is that it's their fastest model. And in a lot of cases, it performs just as well as GPT-4. One of the cases where it does not perform as well is in standardized tests. So if we look at the bar exam, the exam you take to become a lawyer, or does it make you a lawyer if you pass? I think so. Anyway, has to do with law. What they call ChatGPT is GPT 3.5 Turbo. It was in the 10th percentile of students on the bar exam versus GPT-4 was in the 90th percentile. So big difference here when we're talking about reasoning, standardized tests, that sort of thing. Additionally, GPT-4 is safer and it's more likely to be factual and also to not respond to inappropriate or disallowed content, which is another subject we'll talk a little bit more about soon. It's much harder to jailbreak, to get around any sort of the walls that OpenAI has put in place. And then finally, this is a pretty big difference. GPT-4 behind the scenes is multimodal, meaning that it's not just a text-to-text model. You can provide images as input. You can provide videos and files, and it can respond with images, videos, files, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Currently, though, most of that functionality is not available through ChatGPT. I'm pretty positive will be unveiled in the coming months, but right now you can basically provide text to GPT-4 via ChatGPT, or if you use the code interpreter, which is brand new and really fun and by far my favorite feature of ChatGPT, you can upload files and images and zip folders and PDFs, but there's still a lot of capability that has not been unleashed on the world just yet. And GPT-4 supports plugins, the code interpreter, and web browsing until like a couple days ago when web browsing was temporarily suspended because people were abusing it. We have a whole section to talk about that as well. So, of course, the problem here with GPT-4 is that it's not available for free. It's only available to ChatGPT Plus subscribers. The question is it worth it? Do you need it? My answer is that it really depends. You need it if you want to follow along with every single part of this course. But the first 80% of our ChatGPT content will work with GPT 3.5 on the free tier or GPT-4. The sections on the code interpreter and plugins and web browsing, you will have to pay in order to have access to those features. And as far as how GPT 3.5 Turbo performs, It does very well in most situations, unless you're trying to get it to pass a standardized test. You're trying to work on, some really high complex reasoning and logic problems. It works great for most writing situations. So it is not a necessity. But if you plan on using ChatGPT and incorporating it into your workflows daily, I think it's worth it to pay the $20 a month, which is what it currently costs, to get access to ChatGPT Plus, which gives you early access to beta features, and then, of course, GPT-4. My recommendation would be, if you have the $20 and you're serious enough about it, try it for 1 month. See if it's worth it. Definitely, it's not a requirement, and you can get through most of this course without it. But if you want to use every possible feature, including the code interpreter, then you do need to pay $20 a month. Okay, one last quick thing you need to know about how the GPT family of models works is that they don't necessarily think in words. Instead, they operate using a system of tokens, where words are basically encoded. They're turned into these smaller pieces, a token, and these tokens often are actually full words, but for longer words, they'll be a portion of a word. On average, they're 4 English characters of text. So the sentence, "I like hamburgers," is split into 5 different tokens. I is one token, space like is another token, space ham is another token, erg is a token, and ers is a token. And I'm not just making up these exact tokens. OpenAI actually has a tokenizer tool on their website that helps you visualize how text is encoded into tokens. However, it is not up to date. It only has GPT-3 in here. But if I put some text in there like, "Hello, everyone, how many tokens are in this sentence?" If I scroll down, it looks like, well, actually in this case, pretty much every word is its own token. Hello, and then space everyone, space how, space many. These are all individual tokens. But for whatever reason, if I do hamburger, you can see it is split into separate tokens. Again, this is specific to GPT-3. GPT-4 has its own encoding algorithm. There are ways of figuring out the tokens, but you really don't need to worry about it unless you're a developer and you're using the APIs, which is a lot of what we talk about in my course on using the GPT family of APIs. The reason I bring this up is that, first, it's just good to know, but more importantly, each model has a limit to how many tokens it can work with, and that includes both the input and the output. So if we go back to this slide here, where we talked about how GPT doesn't really have a memory, right? Instead, every message that we've ever typed to it within a conversation and every response it generated, they're all fed back to the model every time I add a new message, and then it responds. So each piece of text here is encoded into a certain number of tokens, and the response is a certain number of tokens. And each model has its own limit on the overall size of what we call the context window. How many tokens can the model work with? So these models currently can't take an entire book as an input. They can take a lot of text, especially GPT-4, but there is a limit, and I'll show you the limits in a moment. When I say context window, it's not just about the input that we provide or just the output. It's the total number of tokens from the input plus the output. That is the hard limit that we're working with anytime we have a conversation with ChatGPT or anytime we work with the models using their APIs. There is a limit on how many tokens the overall input plus output text have to be within. They don't do a great job talking about this for ChatGPT on their documentation, but if you go to the developer documentation, we can see that GPT-4 has a maximum context window of 8,000 tokens. There is a different version of GPT-4 that's not available right now to ChatGPT users that has a much larger context window. And if we look at 3.5, we're dealing with 4,096 tokens, so half the size as GPT-4. Later on, I'll show an example of hitting that context window limit and what happens if you have too much text that you're trying to work with. But for now, all you need to know is that there is a limit and that these models are not infinitely able to process text and generate text. There is a hard number on the number of not quite words, but the number of tokens that they can work with. That context window is the input plus the output combined. Something like this is well within that limit. You really have to start trying very hard to hit that limit, especially with GPT-4, which is something that I will try to do to demonstrate the context limit later on in the course.